The individual known to history as Queen Anne of England entered the world on February 6, 1665, at St. James's Palace in Westminster, which at that time lay on the outskirts of London. Her father, James, Duke of York, was a younger son of King Charles I, who had found himself in conflict with nearly every political faction within his three kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland in the early 1640s, and was ultimately executed by the English Parliament in early 1649. Consequently, James and other members of his family had spent a significant portion of the 1640s and the entirety of the 1650s in exile on the continent during the brief ascendancy of an English republic known as the Commonwealth. It collapsed in 1660, and the royal House of Stuart was invited back to England, where James's older brother Charles restored the monarchy and was crowned as King Charles II. Charles had fathered several illegitimate children by the time Anne was born, but had only married in 1662 and had not yet produced a legitimate heir. Thus, Anne's father held the position of heir to the throne at the time of her birth. Anne's mother was Anne Hyde, a daughter of Edward Hyde, one of the most steadfast proponents of the royalist cause during the crisis of the mid-17th century. Following the restoration of the monarchy, Edward Hyde had been elevated to a preeminent position within Charles II's government and was soon granted a peerage as the Earl of Clarendon. His daughter Anne had commenced a relationship with James while still in exile. They married not long after returning to England in what amounted to something of a shotgun wedding, as Anne was clearly pregnant by then with their first child, a boy named Charles, who sadly succumbed to smallpox at just 6 months old. The initial instance of a challenging reproductive and family history that would afflict this branch of the royal family for the subsequent 40 years. Though young Charles had passed away when Anne arrived in 1665, she did have an older sister and brother, Mary, born in 1662, and James, born in 1663. Anne was born with a medical condition that resulted in excessive watery discharge from her eyes, a condition now termed defluxion. The most skilled medical practitioners in Europe at the time were located in France, where the French court was becoming the epicenter of European culture. Anne's parents sent her there at a very young age for treatment for the condition. While there, she resided with her grandmother, Queen Henrietta Maria, the widow of King Charles I, near Paris, and then for a period with her aunt, James's sister, Henrietta Anne. When her aunt died prematurely in the summer of 1670 from what is believed to have been a ruptured ulcer, Anne was brought back to England. Poor health of the kind that had prompted her being sent to France as a child would trouble her throughout her life. Back home, she and Mary were raised at Richmond, south of London. Their paternal uncle, the king, insisted that they be brought up as Protestants, despite the fact that both their parents adhered to Roman Catholicism. At Richmond, their education was broadly entrusted to the Bishop of London, Henry Compton. Failing that, Anne's father might succeed Charles, but even if this were to occur, Anne already had both an older brother and an older sister, who were second and third in line to the throne. And there was also ample time for her parents to have further children, as they did, with two boys named Charles and Edgar arriving in 1666 and 1667. And yet, in the years following her birth, Anne only briefly moved further from the throne in the lines of succession before rapidly moving back closer to it. Charles, despite fathering over a dozen illegitimate children with about half a dozen mistresses, never had a legitimate child with Catherine. Over time, it became increasingly clear that James would succeed his brother. But what was more, Mary and Anne would remain close to the throne in the line of succession, as their mother Anne died in 1671 and each of their 4 brothers died before reaching their 4th birthday. Thus, from the early 1670s onwards, Anne was third in line to the throne, after her father and her only remaining sibling, Mary. All of this was further complicated by the fact that James was a Roman Catholic, a problematic religious affiliation in a country where Protestantism and English nationalism had become inextricably linked through a century of struggle, from the Reformation of the 1530s down to the civil wars of the 1640s. In due course, their father's Catholicism would profoundly influence the trajectory of both Mary's and Anne's lives. Anne's life, as will become evident, was in many respects a tragic one, marked by death and family discord. This had commenced early with the deaths of all her brothers in infancy. Her mother's passing in 1671 intensified this suffering and proved particularly difficult for Anne, who had spent her younger years in France and had barely known her mother on any level before she died. To exacerbate matters, when her father remarried in 1673 to Mary of Modena, Anne did not form a good relationship with her Italian stepmother, and their interactions were strained. As a result of all this, the person Anne was closest to was her sister Mary. But in 1677, this relationship too was abruptly interrupted when Mary married William of the House of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder, and she departed for the Low Countries. Deprived of her family, Anne turned to her friend, Sarah Jennings, with whom she would forge a lifelong bond. 5 years Anne's senior, Jennings married John Churchill, the future first Duke of Marlborough, in the winter of 1677. Anne's relationship with the Churchills would have a tremendous impact on her life and her administration after becoming queen, though there is no conclusive evidence whatsoever to suggest that her relationship with Sarah was sexual in nature, as some depictions have intimated. The late 1670s and into the early 1680s brought fresh challenges for Anne, as national hysteria over a fabricated Catholic plot led to widespread scrutiny of her father's Catholicism, and even an attempt in the Parliament, though unsuccessful, to exclude James from the succession on account of his religion. James and his second wife spent time away from England in the Low Countries and subsequently in Scotland amidst what is termed the exclusion crisis. Anne joined them for a time on these excursions away from England. By the time they finally returned home in 1682, negotiations were underway with several European aristocratic and royal families to determine whom Anne would marry. Ultimately, the choice fell upon George, Prince of Denmark and Norway, a brother of King Christian IV of Denmark and Norway. The union was negotiated on the premise that England had become overly reliant on an alliance with the Dutch through Mary's marriage to William of Orange, and thus a Danish alliance would broaden England's foreign policy options in the event of a European war. The wedding was solemnized in July 1683 at St. James's Palace. George was 30, Anne was 18. Anne became pregnant within weeks, though the pregnancy resulted in a stillbirth the following year, the first of a dozen stillbirths and miscarriages that Anne would endure in a difficult reproductive history. Anne's uncle, King Charles II, passed away on February 6, 1685. Despite his large number of illegitimate children, his marriage had not yielded an heir, and he had resisted advice to act like a latter-day King Henry VIII and divorce his wife and remarry to produce a legitimate heir. Consequently, Anne's father succeeded as King James II. The accession of a Catholic monarch, the first Roman Catholic to rule England since Queen Mary Tudor back in the 1550s, presented difficulties, though in an era when the scientific revolution and the initial glimmerings of the European Enlightenment were beginning to dissipate the most severe aspects of the religious tensions that had characterized Europe since the commencement of the Reformation in the early 16th century, it was conceivable that James could govern in harmony with a political community that was overwhelmingly Protestant. He obliterated any possibility of that occurring by adopting an aggressive approach to religious policy, openly promoting Roman Catholics to high positions, relaxing laws that favored Protestants over Catholics, and in Ireland, hinting at the prospect of a complete revolution in land ownership to benefit the Irish Catholics who had been dispossessed of their land during the 16th and 17th centuries by Protestant settlers from England, Wales, and Scotland. Within a year or two, considerable tensions were escalating between the new king and the political community, but many observed that James was already in his mid-50s, and as his second marriage had only produced 2 children who had died in infancy up to that point, they anticipated James's imminent demise and the return of his Protestant daughter Mary from the Low Countries to succeed him. Anne's relationship with her father and stepmother grew more strained due to the burgeoning political crisis, as she was a devout Protestant and regarded her father's religion as quasi-idolatrous. Finally, after rapidly becoming pregnant again, Anne suffered another stillbirth in October, effectively losing her 4th child within the span of 9 months. A further miscarriage ensued in April 1688. Understandably, reports at the time suggest that Anne and her husband were emotionally devastated by what had transpired in 1687. What made these events particularly cruel was that little Anne and Mary were not miscarriages or stillbirths, but were otherwise seemingly healthy infants before succumbing to smallpox in February 1687. As the years passed and more miscarriages and stillbirths followed, Anne must have reflected on what might have been had the disease not entered her household early that year. By the time Anne suffered her miscarriage in April 1688, her stepmother, Mary of Modena, was heavily pregnant. In June, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. This immediately triggered a political crisis in England, where many had been counting on James dying before long without a Catholic heir. The birth of a son who would now be raised as a Roman Catholic presented the possibility of decades of state-backed efforts to re-Catholicize England. In this climate, a letter was swiftly dispatched to the Low Countries from some of the leading aristocratic and political figures of England, a letter that implored Anne's brother-in-law, William of Orange, to claim the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland from King James by right of Mary's position in the line of succession. What is termed the Glorious Revolution followed as William crossed to England in early November 1688 with a Dutch army and assumed control of England. Virtually no resistance was offered, and James fled to France, where he sought aid from King Louis XIV, a monarch who had been intermittently at war with the Dutch for many years, and who did not wish to see the most powerful Dutch political figure of the day now in control of Britain. Mary soon crossed to England to join her husband, and she and William were crowned as co-monarchs. Queen Mary VI and King William III at Westminster on April 11, 1689. Anne's reaction to all these events was readily apparent. Although James was her father, she disliked his second wife and detested his religious stance, while her close friend Sarah Churchill advised her to abandon her father. Anne duly complied, fleeing from Whitehall as the political crisis unfolded following William's landing in England. When she returned to London after her father's flight to France, she was unaffected by his exile and deposition and greeted her brother-in-law warmly. There were self-serving political considerations at play here as well. Anne's sister's marriage had not produced children, yet another strand in the wider Stuart family's difficult reproductive history, and as such, Anne was now the heir to her sister and brother-in-law. Furthermore, she was pregnant again, and against all odds, Anne gave birth to a healthy baby boy named William after his uncle-in-law, the new king, on July 24, 1689. Prince William would live longer than any of Anne's other children, though he too would eventually fall victim to the family curse. While the coronation was being planned and held, and the new rulers were settling into governing the three kingdoms, war was imminent. James had no intention of passively accepting the loss of his thrones. And in France, King Louis XIV was eager to exploit the situation to launch a new war against the Dutch Republic and England. James also garnered significant support in Ireland, where the Catholic majority had anticipated years of favorable treatment under a Catholic monarch. Thus, what is known variously as the War of the League of Augsburg or the 9 Years' War erupted and would continue until 1697. Its primary focus in the early years was Ireland, where James headed to assume control of the country and use it as a launching point to reclaim England. William met the challenge there, and over the course of 1690 and 1691, the war there was won for the Protestant cause. James fled back to France and would spend the remainder of his life in exile there. The legacy of the revolt in Ireland would later influence Anne's administration and policies. Anne's position within the new government and royal structure proved challenging. On one hand, there is no doubt about the sisterly affection between Anne and Mary, a bond forged through shared family trauma. While death and religious differences had either claimed or estranged everyone else in their extended family, Anne and Mary had found common ground. This was, however, offset by other factors. Firstly, Anne had a difficult relationship with William, whom she perceived as being responsible for obstructing her request for a substantial pension and the use of Richmond Palace. Decisions linked to his desire for fiscal prudence domestically when funds were needed to finance the ongoing war with the French. These familial difficulties were compounded by Anne's ongoing reproductive issues. Another daughter, again named Mary, as it was customary at the time to reuse the names of children who had died in infancy, had survived for only a few hours in October 1690 after being born prematurely. The same experience recurred with a son named George in April 1692. There would be 8 further stillbirths and miscarriages down to 1,700, with 4 miscarriages alone in the course of 1696 and 1697. Additionally, contemporary reports suggested that in the case of at least one of these miscarriages, and perhaps 2, Anne was carrying twins. In total, she would experience 12 miscarriages and stillbirths, while of the 5 children who survived birth, only one, Prince William, born in 1689, lived to see his second birthday. There has been considerable debate regarding the reasons for Anne's challenging reproductive history, which was severe even by the standards of the time when 1 in 3 children did not survive infancy. Theories have ranged from lupus, an autoimmune disease that causes the body to attack healthy tissue, to severe diabetes or pelvic inflammatory disease. Rhesus incompatibility, a blood complication, is also a possible culprit, as this condition makes pregnancies progressively more difficult with increasing numbers of miscarriages and stillbirths, and Anne's situation did indeed worsen over time, with all 8 of her final pregnancies resulting in stillbirths and miscarriages. To further complicate matters, Anne was herself an increasingly unwell woman, suffering from gout and other conditions that left her overweight and unable to walk any significant distance unaided from her early 30s onwards. In the early winter of 1694, Queen Mary contracted the same condition that had claimed 2 of Anne's few healthy children 7.5 years earlier, smallpox. She died from it on December 28, 1694. Anne was pregnant at the time of her sister's illness and wrote to Mary expressing her wish to attend to her on her sickbed, but Mary refused. Whether this was due to concern that Anne had not had smallpox and could contract a highly contagious and dangerous disease, or was a consequence of the falling out between the sisters remains unclear. The result was that Anne never saw her sister again. Her only remaining family now were her husband and her one surviving child, Prince William, and her father and his second family in exile on the continent. She did not immediately succeed as queen at this point. Instead, William would continue to rule as king, though an agreement between him and the English Parliament stipulated that any children he might father if he remarried would be excluded from the succession, and Anne would succeed him if she outlived her brother-in-law, a provision reached to prevent the widely disliked Dutch king from effectively establishing a foreign royal lineage to rule over England. Thus, from the final days of 1694, Anne was only one death away from the throne. By the time of Mary's passing in December 1694, the 9 Years' War had begun to wind down, another European conflict of the time that commenced with a flurry of energetic campaigns before descending into stalemate and incurring enormous costs for all involved, with little of consequence being achieved. The Peace of Ryswick, agreed upon in 1697, effectively represented a return to the pre-war situation, with only minor border adjustments in the Low Countries and French acknowledgement of William's succession in James II's deposition. James would live out the remainder of his life in France until his death there in 1701. His son and grandson subsequently became the focus of the Jacobite cause into the 18th century, and efforts were launched in 1715 and as late as 1745 to restore this Catholic branch of the House of Stuart to the throne. Anne would not live to witness those revolts, though in the latter half of the 1690s, she did engage in a brief correspondence with her father on the continent, in which she requested James to acknowledge the legitimacy of her succession should she indeed succeed William in the near future. The conclusion of the 9 Years' War brought only a brief respite to Europe from the conflicts that characterized relations between states in the early modern era. Already in the Peace of Ryswick, provisions had been laid out for addressing the growing succession crisis in Spain, where the reigning monarch, King Charles II, was a sickly young man who had suffered from what appears to have been hydrocephalus and other conditions throughout his life. The only complication was that Maria Theresa had married King Louis XV of France decades earlier, and so Philip of Anjou was a member of the French royal family. His succession as King of Spain and master of Spain's empire in the Americas could not be tolerated by other powers such as England and the Dutch Republic, while the Austrians were also opposed as their ruling family was related to the Spanish Habsburgs, and they believed that an Austrian candidate should become the next king of Spain. The dispute escalated during 1701 into the War of the Spanish Succession, pitting France, Spain, and a number of German states such as Bavaria against England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, Prussia, and eventually Portugal and Savoy as well. Although the war commenced while William was still on the throne, it would primarily define Anne's reign. The cause of his death is still debated. Some suspected smallpox or scarlet fever at the time. The medical consensus today points to acute bacterial pharyngitis, which also led to pneumonia and was further complicated by hydrocephalus. Anne was clearly devastated by the loss of her last child, and for the remainder of her life, July 30th would be observed as a day of mourning within the royal household. Prince William's death also further complicated the succession, as Anne would now have no heir. Hence, early in 1701, the English Parliament initiated the process of enacting an Act of Settlement, which legally barred any Roman Catholic from succeeding to the throne of England, a measure designed to prevent James II's son from attempting to succeed Anne in the years to come. who might become monarch down the line, remained a point of contention, but the English political community was resolute that it would not be a Catholic. Anne would occupy the throne before long. William III survived long enough to oversee the initial stages of the War of the Spanish Succession, but he died shortly thereafter on March 8, 1702. Days later, she delivered a well-received speech before the English Parliament, in which she underscored the fact that William had been a foreign interloper from the Dutch Republic and welcomed a return to a fully English monarchy, notwithstanding the fact that the House of Stuart was Scottish in origin. Anne's coronation was organized and held relatively quickly on St. George's Day, April 23, 1702. It was an unusual ceremony, given that the new queen was by then largely unable to walk due to her gout, and so she was carried through Westminster Abbey during the ceremony by the yeomen of the guard. It was a somber affair in many respects, one in which, apart from her husband, virtually no family members remained alive to participate. Upon becoming queen, Anne adopted a somewhat non-interventionist approach to monarchy. Over several centuries, England had developed into a constitutional monarchy where Parliament wielded greater power than in virtually any other European nation at the time. The king or queen of the day had still been largely in charge of the country until the 17th century, but the civil wars of the 1640s and subsequently the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had definitively shifted the balance in favor of Parliament, with legislation effectively passed after William and Mary assumed the throne, stipulating that the crown could not dictate national policy. Instead, henceforth, it would always require parliamentary approval. With this, Parliament became the primary body controlling the government and policies of England and subsequently Britain. Unlike some of her successors, notably King George III, who in the first half of his long reign attempted to control national policy on certain issues, Anne was quite content to allow the lawmakers in Parliament to manage affairs. Some of her initial interventions were significant and included promoting her husband to become Lord High Admiral, responsible for the Royal Navy, and the advancement of her great friend Sarah Churchill's husband John to the position of Captain General to oversee the war effort against the French and Spanish. He was also granted the title of Duke of Marlborough and made one of England's premier peers in 1702. Marlborough's promotion held considerable importance, as he was soon involved in some of the most consequential military actions England undertook during the early modern period. In the initial years of the War of the Spanish Succession, England's ally Austria faced an internal challenge when Francis Rákóczi, a leading Hungarian nobleman, exploited the war and revolted against the government in Vienna, with the French also making moves to descend upon Austrian territory through Germany and northern Italy. In conjunction with their ally in southern Germany, Bavaria, it became imperative for the English and the Dutch to come to Austria's aid before Vienna itself was threatened. The outcome, fought on August 13, 1704 in southern Germany, was the Battle of Blenheim, named after the nearby village of Blenheim and rendered into English as Blenheim. Here Marlborough secured a comprehensive victory over the French and Bavarians, one in which half of the approximately 55,000-strong Franco-Bavarian force were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, compared to around 5,000 English and Allied troops. Victory at Blenheim halted the advance on Vienna, prevented the Grand Alliance of England, Austria, the Dutch, and their other allies from collapsing, and denied the French the decisive blow they sought to strike. Marlborough was celebrated as a war hero across Europe. Domestically, in the aftermath of the battle, he and Sarah commenced construction of Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, a magnificent country house and estate that Anne helped finance over many years. It truly ranks among England's greatest country houses and has been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Victory at Blenheim prevented the French from winning the war against England and its allies. However, Anne's government faced many more years of fighting. Over the course of her reign, the War of the Spanish Succession evolved into a conflict that spanned vast distances. It was not solely fought by armies in Western Europe. Large naval detachments operated far from England and France in the Mediterranean and the Americas. Thus, just 2 weeks before Blenheim, a massive Anglo-Dutch expedition landed at and occupied the Rock of Gibraltar in southern Spain. It would remain under English control. While Anne did not assume an overly active role in state affairs, she did, like all royals, patronize the arts and learning in England. She served, for instance, as a major patron of Godfrey Kneller, a German-born portrait artist who had relocated to England in the late 1670s. There he became the preeminent portraitist in the country and his depictions of the scientist Isaac Newton and the philosopher John Locke are widely recognized. Anne commissioned him to produce a series of paintings of England's leading naval commanders, works that are housed in the National Maritime Museum today. She was an even more active patron of the Swedish painter Michael Dahl, who painted portraits of both Anne and her husband. His fondness for animals was evident in his commissioning of a series of paintings by the Hungarian artist Jakub Bogdani, a figure renowned for his depictions of animals and exotic birds within pastoral landscape settings. In the realm of architecture, he commissioned Nicholas Hawksmoor to construct the Orangery at Kensington Palace, a structure Anne utilized for social gatherings at Kensington, noteworthy for its innovative installation of a form of central heating beneath the floor and the provision of a conservatory for plants. Lastly, he enlisted Henry Wise, one of the era's most prominent landscape architects and gardeners, to design new gardens at both Kensington and Hampton Court. Although Anne's personal inclination was to assume a minimalist role in the management of governmental affairs, her reign did encompass many significant political developments on the domestic front, and as queen, she held a role in determining whether or not to sanction legislation. For the most part, when it came to religious policy, he was content to align with parliamentary suggestions. The Test Acts and other measures enacted during his uncle, King Charles II's reign, had aimed to restrict the ability of Catholics to hold public office in England. These measures were reinforced, as was the official policy favoring moderate Protestantism, the latter achieved through the passage of the Occasional Conformity Bill, a measure designed to prevent Protestants, such as the Baptists, who dissented from the established Church of England, of which Anne was the supreme head, from also holding office. On the latter occasion, the bill had been rejected in part because religious dissenters had stirred up public sentiment regarding the ungodly nature of the bill in the aftermath of the Great Storm of 1703. This hurricane-like cyclonic storm had swept through southern England and London, accompanied by lightning and extensive flooding in late November 1703, peaking around the 26th of the month. It demolished thousands of homes, uprooted thousands of trees in the New Forest, and toppled thousands of stone chimneys in London. Hundreds of merchant, fishing, and even naval vessels were also lost in the English Channel, hindering the war effort against France and Spain. The fatalities are estimated to have approached 10,000 people, in an event that the Baptists and others subsequently portrayed as a manifestation of divine wrath concerning the proposed passage of the Occasional Conformity Bill. Part of the Tower of London even sustained damage. In the midst of the storm, Anne was at St. James's Palace in the vicinity of Whitehall and Westminster when the storm struck London. He and his household staff were compelled to seek shelter in the cellar to avoid the hazards posed by collapsing stone chimneys and sections of the roof. Afterwards, he referred to the storm as, quote, "a calamity so dreadful and astonishing that the like hath not been seen or felt in the memory of any persons." The delay in revisiting the Occasional Conformity Bill after the Great Storm and its rejection in 1704 was due to shifting attention northward to Scotland. Scotland had been England's fierce adversary throughout the High Middle Ages, late medieval period, and into the early modern era. But in 1603, that dynamic fundamentally changed when Anne's great-grandfather, James VI of Scotland, succeeded Elizabeth I of England by virtue of his descent from a sister of King Henry VIII. This united the crowns of England, Scotland, and Ireland into a triple monarchy, with James becoming known as King James I of England and Ireland and James VI of Scotland. While monarchical union was achieved, Scotland retained a considerable degree of independence, notably its own parliament and a semi-autonomous administration at Holyrood in Edinburgh. There was no clearer indication of this continuing autonomy than in the late 1630s, when King Charles I, Anne's grandfather, attempted to interfere in the governance of the Scottish Church, or Kirk, and consequently found himself at war with the Scots for his troubles. It was during Anne's reign that this arrangement came to an end, and Scotland was politically absorbed into a more centralized British state. The immediate factors driving this change were complex. For one, Scotland had experienced a very challenging economic and social crisis in the 1690s and early 1700s. One facet of this was a brutal famine that persisted for much of the decade and is referred to in Scottish history as the 7 ill years. Mass fatalities had occurred in Scotland as a result of the famine, and tens of thousands of people fled the country to Ulster in Northern Ireland. Others sought opportunities even further afield, and an ill-conceived plan was initiated by the Scottish political and business community to attempt to colonize the Darien region around the Isthmus of Panama in Central America. The English Parliament went on the offensive in 1705 by passing the Alien Act, which effectively threatened to treat Anne's Scottish subjects as foreign subjects if the Scottish Parliament did not repeal the Act of Security. Anne approved of these measures, and he went further in 1706 by sanctioning the creation of a commission to propose an Act of Union to both the English and Scottish parliaments. Under the terms of this proposed act, the Scottish Parliament would be dissolved along with the independent status of the Scottish Crown, thereby forming England and Scotland into the unified state and monarchy of Britain. Through a strategy employing both incentives and disincentives, economic and political threats, coupled with concessions on many issues, the government succeeded in securing the passage of the Act of Union in both England and Scotland. It became law in 1707, and Anne ceased being the Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland, becoming instead the first Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. The Act of Union stood as the most significant political development of his reign, and its legacy is still apparent today. Anne's reign was also notable in terms of the governance of Ireland. Ireland continued to possess its own parliament, and the government there was headed by a viceroy in Dublin, appointed as the monarch's direct representative. This notwithstanding, constitutional arrangements stipulated that parliamentary legislation in Ireland had to be managed from England, meaning the final decision on any policy for the country rested at Westminster. One such policy enacted during Anne's reign was the extension of the penal laws. This constituted a series of punitive legislative measures that had been introduced since the mid-1690s to politically, socially, and economically disenfranchise Roman Catholics in the country, even further than they already had been by the close of the 17th century. The legislation was implemented as a response to the support Anne's father had garnered among Catholics there after he was deposed by William and Mary. These penal laws encompassed everything from preventing Catholics from inheriting land or possessing firearms to even imposing restrictions on owning horses or receiving an education. Perhaps the most petty was a prohibition on the use of stone and bricks in the construction of Catholic churches. Instead, they were required to be built of wood. The penal laws, many of which were enacted in the 1700s after Anne's accession, laid the groundwork for 2 centuries of a form of apartheid rule in Ireland, with a small Protestant ascendancy class completely dominating the Catholic majority. Ultimately, they proved counterproductive, as Britain would have to contend with constant rebellions and agrarian terrorism in Ireland. Back in England, the political dynamics of the era began to strain Anne's relationship with Sarah Churchill. By this time, 2 distinct, nascent political parties had emerged in the English Parliament. Until the 17th century, organized parties had not existed, only factions that formed in support of or opposition to specific policies. That changed during Anne's uncle's reign as 2 distinct groups materialized. One was conservative and more loyal to the crown. These were derogatorily termed Tories by the more liberal-minded members of the House of Commons, a term otherwise applied to a type of Irish bandit. The Tories eventually coalesced into a cohesive party, the direct predecessors of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom today. Their opponents by the 1700s were the Whigs, the more liberal members of Parliament who believed the crown should play a more limited role in governing England. By disposition, Anne was more inclined to favor the Tories. However, her closest friend, Sarah Churchill, was a supporter of the Whigs, with her husband being one of the party's leaders, and by the mid-1700s, she was increasingly utilizing her influence over the Queen to promote their policies and persuade Anne to appoint Whig MPs to high office. Anne indulged her for quite some time, but by 1706 and 1707, he had grown weary of Sarah's interference, a factor that also contributed to Anne's growing friendship with Abigail Hill, the daughter of a prosperous London merchant who had been offered a position on the Queen's household staff back in 1704. Matters came to a head in 1708. A number of factors contributed to this. One was the so-called screw plot. This involved an alleged attempt to assassinate Anne during a Thanksgiving Mass offered to celebrate the British and Dutch victory over the French at the Battle of Oudenarde in what is now Belgium that midsummer. Screws were found loosened from the supporting beams of the roof of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, directly above the royal bench, and some speculated that the Whigs had conspired to cause the beams to collapse and kill Anne, who at that precise time was leaning more towards the Tories in government and parliament. Sarah and Anne also argued at the doors of St. Paul's Cathedral before the Mass over Anne's choice of jewels. Then just weeks later, Anne's husband died. Anne, having experienced so much death in his life, was grief-stricken, but the overbearing Sarah chose not to offer solace, instead ordering that portraits of George be removed from the royal residences, claiming it was best for Anne not to see these while mourning. The Queen clearly did not take kindly to this idea. All these occurrences led to a growing rift between Anne and Sarah. More broadly, however, despite the rupture between friends, Anne's reign has been viewed as marking a positive step towards a two-party system within England's politics, one that was emulated in subsequent decades in the United States and other countries. As the monarchy and nobility became more sedentary and less involved in military affairs, and as gambling grew as a perilous vice among the aristocracy, the popularity of horse racing soared. Anne was a fan, and late in his reign, he ordered the development of a new race course near the village of Ascot in Berkshire, a location ideal for Anne's reduced mobility, as it lay much closer to London and Westminster than Newmarket and was less than 10 kilometers away from another royal residence, Windsor Castle. The track opened in 1711. Royal Ascot continues to commemorate Anne's patronage, with one section of the grounds known as the Queen Anne Enclosure. While the first race on the opening day of the race meeting at Ascot each year is known as the Queen Anne Stakes. The rift between Anne and Sarah never fully healed. This had implications for the war effort against France and Spain, which had dragged on for years. The Battle of Oudenarde and other victories had given the British, the Dutch, and the Austrians the upper hand by the early 1710s. Still, clandestine negotiations were being conducted between some Tory-aligned members of Anne's government and the French to explore terms for ending the war and the enormous financial burden it was imposing on all parties. This ran counter to the Churchills' interests, with Marlborough pushing for an invasion of France and a strike against Paris, a measure that would incur fresh expense. Amidst promoting this lavish scheme, he suddenly faced charges pressed against him by his enemies in Parliament and the government, who accused him of embezzling vast sums of money in his position as head of the military during the war. Marlborough was able to refute many of the more absurd accusations. Nonetheless, in a sign of how much Anne and Sarah had distanced themselves, the Queen dismissed him as the wartime leader in December 1711. The French were delighted, and concerted peace talks now commenced. Marlborough and Sarah went into voluntary exile, touring Central Europe, where the great victor of Blenheim and Oudenarde was celebrated. With his departure from the scene, the Treaty of Utrecht was agreed upon in 1713, largely concluding the War of the Spanish Succession. Philip of Anjou was recognized as the new king of Spain, provided that the thrones of France and Spain would never be held by the same member of the French House of Bourbon. Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca, as well as extensive trading concessions in the Atlantic, most of which regrettably led to a significant increase in its involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. It represented a victory of sorts for Anne's government, and Gibraltar remains a British possession to this day, though perhaps more might have been achieved had Marlborough remained in command to see the war to its conclusion. By the time the initial peace treaties were being signed at Utrecht in the Low Countries in 1713, Anne's health was in serious decline. He had always been plagued by ill health of one kind or another, and now in his late 40s, his condition further deteriorated. For example, while his mobility had been limited for many years, he had retained the ability to stand and walk short distances. This changed in the spring of 1713 when he effectively lost all ability to remain on his feet. There were also a growing number of occasions when he suffered from fevers or other ailments that prevented him from attending meetings with government ministers or other state events. When he did manage to attend, his patience was tested by the effective head of the government, Robert Harley, 1st Earl of Oxford, a Tory-leaning politician who had been Marlborough's chief opponent for years. He had recently succumbed to alcoholism and often appeared at government meetings inebriated. Thus, with his family members, children, and husband long gone, his oldest friend in exile with her husband on the continent and overseeing a government led by a borderline alcoholic, Anne spent his final 2 years. He suffered a stroke on July 30th, 1714, the 14th anniversary of his son, Prince William's death, a stroke that left him unable to speak. Anne died at 49 years of age the following morning. His physician, John Arbuthnot, writing to the author of Gulliver's Travels, Political pamphleteer and satirist Jonathan Swift remarked of Anne's death that, quote, "I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveler than death was to her. His body was so severely swollen from gout and dropsy that he had to be interred in an outsized, square-shaped coffin. He was laid to rest next to his husband and his many children who had died in infancy in the Collegiate Chapel of St. Peter's in Westminster Abbey." At the time of Anne's death, the succession issue was far from resolved. Even as the Queen lay dying, some leading government officials, such as Viscount Bolingbroke, the Secretary of State, were clandestinely discussing the possibility of arranging for one of Anne's other relatives, who had sided with James II and been in exile in France, to succeed to the throne, notably his son, James Francis, a Roman Catholic. Others were more pragmatic and believed the only way to avert a fresh crisis was to have a Protestant heir. Queen Anne stands as one of England's and Britain's most peculiar monarchs in many respects. His reign was a highly significant one that witnessed numerous developments and constitutional innovations. The two-party political system that would influence democracies worldwide in the years to come emerged. The War of the Spanish Succession was fought. In Ireland, the expansion of the penal laws set the stage for a further 2 centuries of political bitterness and division there, making Ireland one of the few problems Britain was never able to resolve during its imperial expansion. The most enduring legacy, however, lay in the Act of Union, with Scotland's relationship with England shifting from one of union to a form of domination, at least from the Scottish perspective. The implications of that remain potent today, as the Scottish independence referendum of 2014 demonstrated. Nevertheless, Anne was often a bystander in these events during an era when it increasingly required an active and assertive monarch to impose their will over that of Parliament in England. Instead, his life and reign were overshadowed by his personal tragedies. The Queen, who lost his mother, all his siblings, and his father before he was 30, either through death or political and religious conflict, and who lost all of his 17 children, 12 of them before they were even born. Inevitably, his story is more about these tragedies than anything related to his queenship. What is your view of Queen Anne? Was he, in many ways, the most tragic monarch of England and Britain, given his abnormally unfortunate reproductive history?